Hi, everyone, and welcome to the CIH podcast. My name is Justin Cartwright. My day job is National Director for Northern Ireland at the Chartered Institute of Housing. I'm also the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Lead for CIH. So today's we're going to be looking at how to diversify the workplace, where to start, where people can go, because it's not a straightforward issue. It's a timely discussion because we've got this month as Pride Month and also Gypsy, Roma and Traveller History Month. So today's discussion is about what it means to ensure that EDI, equality, diversity, and inclusion, is at the front of the agenda when it comes to things like representative boardrooms and governance structures, which is on the minds of housing organisations and organisations more broadly as well, because of course it's not just a housing challenge. So to help me with today's discussion, I'm joined with three special guests. With us today, we have Sharon, who's CEO at Shape Talent. And Shape Talent works with large organisations to solve talent pipeline challenges with a particular focus on increasing women's representation in leadership roles. We have Dan Revel-Wiseman, who's a board member of our EDI board here at CIH. And Dan's day job is Regional Director for Amplius, which is a middle to large association based across the Midlands and the Southeast, managing a diverse range of homes and services, covering about 40,000 homes. And last but certainly not least, we have Pedro Cameron, also an EDI board member for CIH. And Pedro's day job is Tenant Participation and Engagement Manager for the Tenants Information Service, or TIS, which is a charity supporting tenants and groups, helping people to work together to improve housing services. So Sharon, Dan and Pedro, you're all very welcome. So the conversation about equality, diversity and inclusion. So housing providers exist to serve their communities. Fundamentally, we're there to provide the homes and the services that people need that meets their specific requirements. Mm-hmm. But yet, research and our day-to-day knowledge shows that workforces don't tend or don't always reflect the diversity of the people that they serve, which is a structural issue. If you're trying to deliver homes and services for people and there's a kind of representational barrier or a mismatch there, that can erect issues. So I'm interested in your thoughts on why closing that gap has proven so difficult, and where does responsibility actually sit?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult one because housing and businesses in general, people in general, businesses and the economy, I guess, in general, have often treat diversity as more of it's like a recruitment issue, when it's really a whole organization issue and it's a societal issue. So you can't sort of just put out a policy or a sort of inclusive advert and sort of expect decades or centuries or millennia of exclusion and class barriers, racism, homophobia, transphobia, progression gaps that kind of disappear. So I think it's sort of something that needs to start much earlier than thinking about recruiting. You can't sort of go, okay, we need to identify, we've got a post to fill and we need to make sure that it's sort of meeting some sort of quota that we've sort of decided exists. And so I think before you get to that stage, boards, I think HR, strategies, recruiters, we need to be sort of embedding this into the overall fabric of our organizations and our lives, and not thinking of it as an afterthought. So that the policy needs to come first and not go, oh, the problem isn't, not look at the problem as we don't have enough diversity in our team. It's like, why do we need diversity in our team? And what's it going to improve? So like you said, when we talk about reflecting the tenant base of or reflecting the users of housing services, um, it's about thinking, well, what do those users experiences need to be met? Like how do those experiences and lifestyles and challenges and barriers, how do they impact on how the service that they need, or the um yeah, the housing that they need, or whatever it is. And so I think there's sort of something that needs to be, we need to sort of decide why you want to do that, and you need to listen to the people involved first, and before just deciding, we need to meet some quotas.
Yeah, I'll bring you in now, Sharon, and then go to yourself, Dan. So, Sharon, I mean, you have extensive knowledge of workplace gender equity, particularly in male-dominated industries. So, when we're talking about women's representation specifically, what are some of the barriers surrounding that?
Yeah, great question. We have done our own research into what are the barriers that get in the way of women's representation, and we find they fall into three broad macro categories. There are societal barriers, which are things like gender stereotypes, the way we view the role of women in work and in society. There are organizational barriers. They can be structural. It could be lack of access to the right networks. It could be lack of access to sponsorship. It could be workplace cultures that have this always on mentality. And then the third category, we've got societal, organizational. The third category is personal barriers. So these are how the barriers manifest at an individual level. So for women, there's one of the big barriers is what we call the double bind, this constant need to self-edit your behavior, how you come across. You've got to be confident enough to be seen. But not too confident, because there's a penalty if you're too confident. You get labeled as arrogant. So there's a tightrope that women need to walk in terms of the behaviors that are socially acceptable to display. And when we've done research, we've found that 82% of women experience workplace barriers. So there are barriers that most women are experiencing, which tells us that it's not an individual challenge. It's a structural challenge. It's something about the structures that we work in. And I really like Pedro's earlier point that you can't just undo decades or hundreds of years of kind of these barriers. These exist in society. There's also one other point that, because it is Pride Month, that might be worth raising here too. We did some research a couple of years ago on how this three barriers model, which is designed around understanding the barriers that women face, how that might apply to the LGBTQ plus community, both in terms of gender identity, but also sexual orientation. And we found that the barriers, many of the barriers apply to different segments of the LGBT community as well. And in particular, we found that the trans community faces particular barriers. And I think we all know at the moment it's a pretty hostile time towards the trans community. And we know that some of the highest rates of discrimination in the LGBT community is with trans women. There's some interesting research. This isn't our research, this comes from another source. But the research found that trans women face a pay penalty. They earn about 20% less than when they had identified as a man. And so these barriers, we know they are gendered because we see it in gender identity with the trans community. So having an understanding of these barriers is really, really important so that workplaces can support these individuals.
Thanks, Sharon. That's really insightful, and some, very concerning stats there to support the narrative. Dan, what's your take on some of the barriers?
I think when we're talking about ED&I think the conversation sometimes is quite polarized. I think that it's, for me, certainly it's not a political ideology. It certainly is. It's about box ticking. It's more about fairness and the opportunity to ensuring that organisations can benefit from the widest possible range of talent and perspectives. I think we've all acknowledged that housing exists to serve really diverse communities. And if we want to understand the people we serve, it's important that our workforce reflects that. And I think that ultimately diversity on its own isn't enough. It is, and essentially to pick up on Pedro's point in terms of we're attracting talent, it's the inclusion that makes diversity work within organisations. If we're not getting that part right, we're gonna fail essentially.
Yeah, absolutely, Dan. So thinking about this next question, is for Dan and Pedro specifically, talking about it's about housing providers. So this is about boards and senior leadership teams. It's really their role as kind of governance, strategic roles, senior roles, roles that people would kind of look up to, that have that drive the kind of strategic focus throughout the organization. So, in their role setting that direction, how representative are housing providers right now, from a board perspective, from what you're seeing in housing, and what levers do you think they have to drive diversity from the top down? I'll come to you, Pedro.
So I'm gonna first of all just show some ignorance here, just in terms of housing itself. Obviously, so I am based up in Scotland, and I'm not sure how governance maybe works differently in terms of social housing compared to Scotland. In Scotland, housing associations generally tend to be sort of charitable organizations, and they've got volunteer boards or committees at the top. Particularly, I think there's more of a lean towards, in my understanding anyway, of community-based housing associations in Scotland compared to certainly compared to England. I'm not sure about the rest of the UK. So we recently did some research on behalf of the Scottish Government in terms of ethnic minority representation in tenant participation engagement. And as part of that, we looked at boards and governance, because boards are generally will have tenant members, on their boards. And yeah, I think we found that there was not a tremendous amount of visibility in terms of governance, in terms of diversity. Obviously, there's visible diversity and not so visible kinds of diversity, but we weren't seeing that more generally. And I think that does have a huge impact on how how businesses appear to, particularly to people who want to work within the social housing sphere. I think if we're not seeing, and I think that applies also to how tenants respond to how their social landlords operate, or if they're taking them into account when they are conducting their activities, or when they're making decisions, or when they're strategizing or driving policy or whatever it is. And so I think that because I think we need to see that representation, or we need to see it meaningfully, in terms of sort of attracting, as you say, as you were mentioning there, in terms of attracting talent, in terms of attracting a diverse range of talent. So I think in terms of the visibility of governance, or who is governing organizations, I think that's really important. But that also means that impacts on how the organization is run more generally, and what experiences are sort of leading on that, that strategic kind of level, and at a recruitment level.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because of course, diversity is multifaceted. You want representation of communities, but there are many different characteristics that we're talking about here. I mean, the Northern Ireland housing sector is the one that I know most well, and I think similar to Scotland, the people are they're trustees, but they're all they are charities, so there's no remuneration as such. I mean, Northern Ireland is, and I mean, this is very topical given the kind of racist violence that we saw and those troubling events that you would have seen in the press last week. And of course, it's happening on the ground over here. But in spite of that, I mean, Northern Ireland is the least, racially diverse part of the UK. I think the last census had us at about 98% white, down from 99%. And of course, that does mask Eastern European populations and so on. But it's certainly, a region that is a lot less diverse. So when we're looking, well, in a racial context, so when we're looking at governance structures, they would tend to, reflect the communities on that basis that they serve. But I think, one of the more difficult things to represent is maybe those hidden characteristics. So are we representing neurodivergence at the board level? Are we representing class differences? Because that kind of socioeconomic question is a big one, because the Northern Ireland housing system is very traditional. It's points based. People allocated a home tend to be in very high levels of acute housing need with complex and multiple needs, typically but not exclusively from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, whereas that tends not to be then the representation of board level and so on. So it is a challenge, not just to identify the barriers, but how you kind of start to break down these systemic barriers. Dan, did you have any thoughts on how we what levers the boards have to try to drive that kind of diversity from the top down?
I think one of the biggest responsibilities for leaders is creating a culture where people can succeed based on their talent and performance, regardless of their backgrounds. And I really think that means us looking really honestly at our recruitment processes, progression opportunities, the culture, and whether there are barriers that we may not realise. I think the other thing that I think is a valid point as well is that the leaders of today the leaders of tomorrow are created by the leaders of today. And ultimately, if we're not diversifying our workforce now, it's unlikely that you'll be parachuted into a leadership role or onto a board without having worked within the industry to start with. So we need to start thinking about that now and how we create those opportunities and remove those barriers. So I think that it's maybe slightly understandable we haven't got that diversity at those levels as it is at the moment, but we need to start thinking about what succession looks like for these individuals.
Absolutely. So we've touched on it a couple of times now that diversifying a workforce isn't then just about who you recruit. So I'd like to bring in Sharon on this point. So what do organisations broadly need to do to kind of look beyond the hiring process to make sure that underrepresented groups aren't hitting a ceiling once they're through the door?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because all too often there's a focus on recruitment being the solution. And recruitment is really important, because if you are filtering out certain groups of people at recruitment, of course, that makes a difference. You've got to attract and recruit a broad range of people. But beyond that, you've got to keep them. You've got to keep them engaged. You keep them retained. I can't remember if you said it earlier. It's all about building an inclusive environment that people want to stay, that they thrive in. So there are lots of things that organizations could and should do, but I'm going to call out three things in particular that I think make a big difference. And the first one is creating genuinely family-friendly workplaces. Now, this works particularly for women, but not just women. Something like 80% of the workforce will be parents, so we'll have some kind of caring responsibility. So it kind of works for a large part of your population. We know from research that women, at least women in heterosexual relationships, carry this double burden of paid and unpaid work. So they're doing the paid work of their job and then the unpaid work that goes on at home of domestic and caring responsibilities. So it varies around the world, but in the UK, women do 1.8 times the amount of unpaid care work as their male counterparts in a heterosexual relationship, at least. So that means on average, women are doing something like 4 hours care work a day. Men are doing about 2 hours thereabouts. So if you add that up, there are not many hours in the day to do an 8-hour job 4 hours of caring and domestic responsibilities, any hobbies, any kind of health stuff, exercise that you want to do, pretty quickly run out of time. And so organizations that can offer real flexibility to their workforce, so that might be remote working, hybrid working, flexibility in start and finish times, all of that good stuff, makes a huge difference to women and anyone who is taking that caring load. So that's the first thing. Create genuinely family-friendly workplaces where flexibility is front and center. It really gets brought to life. And that means you get senior leaders role modeling and, it's built into everyday considerations about what time you schedule meetings and what time the day starts and so forth. Right. The second thing I would recommend is, and this sounds really obvious, but it is so important, creating safe workplaces for people to bring their full self to work, their authentic self to work. So we did a study across a number of European countries in 2024, and we ran a root cause analysis on what drives people to leave organizations. And the strongest predictor of leaving intent was this statement that I don't feel bullying and harassment is dealt with appropriately at work. So if people don't feel that they're in a safe place, that they look around and they see people getting away with bullying and harassment, is the number one driver of leaving intent. And so that is it's a management issue, it's a culture issue, it's not an individual issue, it's an organizational issue. We also found in another study that we did that between 4 or 5 in 10 women worry about how they come across in meetings. So they will sit there and they will self-edit and they'll think twice about contributing for fear of being perceived negatively. And it's not because they're lacking the confidence, which people often say, but it's because speaking up has historically carried a higher cost for women than it has for men. So when certain voices carry more risk, then organizations are losing the contribution of the widest talent pool. So that can have a long-term detrimental effect. If people aren't speaking up and they don't feel safe, they're more likely to leave. So second thing is create really safe workplaces for people. And then the final thing, the third thing, is about nurturing the ambition of your workforce and supporting their development. So women's ambition, if I bring it back to women, because this is the area that we know best, women's ambition is not fixed. It is our research and other people's research shows that it's shaped by the experience in the workplace. So if you have a line manager who encourages you to put yourself forward for that project or that promotion, then that ambition is likely to be nurtured. Those women are likely to be more ambitious over time. But we found in a recent study with the Lead Network that women are 2.5 times more likely than men to say that they never get that support from their line leaders, that they don't get support in explaining what they need to do to step up, they don't get the encouragement to step up. And so there's an information gap that's really easy to close. Line leaders can be nurturing, be supportive, give really clear feedback about what needs to be done to progress your career or to progress your skill set. So I think if organizations did those 3 things, they created family-friendly workplaces, they created safe workplaces, and they nurtured ambition and supported the development of their talent, they're much more likely to retain their talent and have a much more engaged workforce.
Thanks, Sharon. Some really insightful and practical suggestions there, I think, for not just housing organizations, but organizations generally to, start to deconstruct some of those barriers that have, that are stopping that progression. Pedro, through the kind of tenant lens and the community development lens, I mean, are you seeing those kind of factors, family-friendly policies, safe workplace environments where people can be sort of nurtured and progressed? Are you seeing that happen on the ground?
I would say, I mean, looking at it from like a tenant participation angle, I mean, I guess it's a lot of the same things when we're looking at EDI particularly. I think it's about, it's like family commitments, like it's childcare, it's managing a disability, it's religious sort of commitments or sort of obligations, it's other sort of caring uh, needs or requirements, or demands. It's things like living with domestic abuse, or, there's all sorts of things there. Maybe a hostile home environment, a hostile, just things outside of work being hostile. Like, Sharon was mentioning earlier about things that are facing the trans community right now, etc. So I think I'm just thinking about in terms of that development, and that growing up from these sort of bottom rung kind of, or entry level kind of positions. It's quite often the people that are relatively privileged, that are able to do above and beyond, do the work, and do that extra work in the evening, coming in early, and so that's very much applies in, as in Sharon's was talking about, in terms of women, and caring for children and families, and housework, and all the things that sort of heterosexual women and have to have to contend with. But yeah, I think I think there's just a question of equity, right? And it's sort of like the expectation of what people need to do in order to progress. And it seems to be, in a lot of cases, it's give more. And when, a lot of people just don't have that extra to give, and it'll sort of keep them at a lower level, and doesn't allow them to progress to sort of a leadership level.
Yeah, absolutely. And Dan, would you like to share any work that sort of Amplius is doing in this space?
Yeah, I think it's important to note that, when it comes to caring responsibilities, particularly, that real life happens, and that those caring responsibilities don't suddenly start at 5 p.m. when you finish work, and it's all very well for us to go, yes, we're family friendly, we allow our members of staff to go to do the school run, for instance. Well, children get sick. If you've got caring responsibilities with other family members, sometimes disappointments happen. So I think it's about the inclusive part of that. I think for me is about us removing, and I think we do this quite well at Amplius, removing that guilt about, I actually need to go because I need to go and do this. This is part of my life. This has happened. And removing that guilt for that person, and trying to remove those barriers of, where other team members could also be understanding enough to pick up that piece of work, or fill them back in with that piece of work when they come back into work. It's bits and pieces like that. And I think we are progressing quite well with that Amplius, actually, frankly. But and I think, if I'm really, really honest, I think that's driven by the fact that we've got a largely female workforce, if I'm really honest. And I think that's what drives that. And we've got a lot of female leaders within the business as well. So I think that's what's driving that forward for us, I think.
That's almost that, because I mean, the profession, by and large, I think that maybe this is a comment about housing specifically, but we know from our membership statistics, for instance, that, a majority of housing professionals and our members, are female. Historically, the housing profession, and, it takes its roots back to Octavia Hill and the women that worked under Octavia Hill, that it was seen as a kind of, there was an overrepresentation of women working in the housing profession. I think that's kind of starting to change, but that sort of, historical kind of makeup has perhaps driven driven some of those things. Like, it's certainly not suggesting that the housing sector is perfect. We've got a lot to work on, but certainly from my perspective, I see a lot of those really important themes running through the kind of blood of the housing movement, if I could put it that way. So I think that kind of commercial head, social heart foundation, is an important one that we're building on and continuing to close a lot of those gaps. So in that vein, it's a good spot to plug a couple of things that CAH is working on. I just wanted to bring everyone's attention to. So firstly, and it's Pride Month, so it's a good time to run this. But we're running our annual EDI census. So it's a call out to all members of CAH to fill in the census if you haven't already. It's not a point in time thing. It's something that we do every year. And what this census is the opportunity for you to tell us a bit about yourself, in terms of equality, characteristics, and so on. So that helps us to get a better idea of what our membership actually looks like, and then enables us to use that information to help tailor and shape our services. Because up until now, I think it's fair to say that we haven't known enough about our membership to be able to appropriately shape the services that we provide. So it's just a call out to fill in the census if you haven't already. The other thing I wanted to flag with everyone is CIH's Equality in Housing Pledge. So this is about, at a very high level, asking organisations to commit publicly to a fairer sector. And there are 3 or 4 specific high-level things that we're asking as part of that pledge, some of which we've discussed today. But so in that vein, and I'm interested to hear from our panelists on the podcast here. So for someone in a senior leadership role, so for a board member or HR director who might be listening to this right now, what's the single most impactful structural change that you think that they could make to genuinely diversify the organisation within the next 12 months? And I'll come to Sharon first on that one.
That's a great question. I would love for listeners to go away and implement some structural change. That is what every organisation needs to be doing. The change that would make the biggest difference, though, does really depend on where you're starting from. So different organizations will be at different starting points. And so my top piece of advice actually is to find out what's causing some groups to be underrepresented in your organization. Before you reach for solutions, do a diagnostic, because action without a diagnostic is really just guesswork. So do a diagnostic, ideally a combination of qualitative and quantitative. If it's an HR director, have a look at your HR data, have a look at your recruitment data, your promotion data, your performance data, your leaving data, see how it varies. You should already have data by gender. If you've got other characteristics as well, great. Not all organizations will, but if you do, if you have ethnicity, if you have disability, if you have anything else that is probably voluntarily provided, have a look at that too. So work out what's going on, where are the gaps, where does representation drop off? And then also balance that with some qualitative data. Ask people, do focus groups, do interviews, do surveys, get their input, find out what the experience is for people. Because if you take the time to do a proper diagnostic, chances are you're going to find that the problems aren't always what you think they are. We certainly find that with our clients. I would say 80 to 90% of the time, the real issue is not the problem that they thought it was. It's something else. So take the time to do a good diagnostic, and then that will set you up to put the time and effort into solving the right problems.
That's all. Really like that. No action without diagnostic. I mean, you need to know a thing or two about the problem that you're trying to rectify. Dan, any thoughts from yourself on any folks in senior leadership positions right now? Any thoughts about the kind of single change that could put folks in train to achieve real action over the next 12 months?
Yeah, I mean, there are lots, but if I'm being forced to pick one, I think the one structural change I would look to make would be ensuring that recruitment and progression are based on transparent, evidence-based processes rather than informal networks and subjective judgment. So talent often is evenly distributed across society, but opportunity often isn't. And I think it's our job and it's the leaders' jobs within the sector to ensure that we somehow close that gap.
That's all. What about yourself, Pedro? What one change that senior leaders could implement?
Well, Daniel and Sharon have kind of covered. I think data is a really big one. I think it's knowing, it's knowing about your workforce and knowing what's there and what's not and that sort of thing. I think I would maybe, it's just not so much a structural thing as more of a I don't know how we would phrase it, but basically, I think the people that are listening to this podcast are likely to be people that already care about this stuff. And so my view is that for the people listening, is that I think sometimes, in our current climate and things like that, I think that, that it's sort of looked at as woke or as you know, as sort of virtue signaling or just something that you have to do because and not really understanding why you have to do it. And I think it's about, I think I would sort of advise or sort of suggest that those who want to make that change is to sort of look at it from a slightly different lens and um, you know, think about it as how you rather than you know, doing it for the sake of it, it's about how you reflect or meet the needs of the people that are using your service. And you know, that representation is how people are happier, how people, you know, feel like your services are meeting their needs and so therefore aren't dissatisfied with it. You know, it's gonna make things better. It's gonna make things easier. It's gonna make things it's gonna make things fairer, certainly. But you know, sometimes I think we need to take the move while the moral side of it is what we're all sort of like railing for. I think sometimes we need to sort of look at it operationally, economically, and sort of make that case for it, as well as anything else.
So thanks, Pedro. And one more shout out, one way that members and non-member organisations can capture some of that is by signing up to the CIH Pledge, Equality in Housing Pledge. It's something that Dan and Pedro have advised us on as EDI board members. So those kind of four high-level areas I spoke about before. So this is about and recognizing that, you know, actions will differ by organizations because every organization has their own operating context, has their own communities, has their own challenges. So these are quite high level, and it's not about a checkbox exercise. You know, we'll not be coming to mark your homework. This is about a public pledge around working towards equality and equity. And those four high level things, one is, you know, we want organizations to diversify. So this is about taking action to increase diversity in the workplace, and that includes on boards and committees. You know, this has to be something where there's strategic weight given to it. You know, if an organisation just says, look, you know, give the EDI work to the person doing the internship, you know, without the kind of resource and strategic weight behind it, then the outcomes are going to be limited. So we really want that to be seen to be at the strategic level. The second thing is upskilling, which, you know, ties in well with our role as a professional body. So this is about ensuring that professional development for staff and colleagues is person specific, you know, that it reflects individual skills and talents, and does include a focus on EDI and marginalised groups. It's about kind of understanding the experience that individual colleagues have working for our organisations and providing a professional development journey to meet their specific needs. The third thing is engaging. So we want organizations to have regular external engagements and recognize that it's not just about, you know, now the internal knowledge within an organization is very powerful, but it's often about reaching beyond that and learning beyond your organization. So it's about, you know, engaging with schools, colleges, other relevant groups about the value and impact of diversity in the workplace. And then the fourth and final area of commitment is around championing the EDI agenda. So this is about appointing a colleague at a senior level to champion and sponsor the EDI work stream. So for us, you know, we have Jerome in our governing board, who's also a member of our EDI board. Obviously myself as the EDI lead, along with my colleague Emma internally to kind of operationalize the direction that we get from Dan and Pedro and others in our governance structure. So it's really about trying to run the EDI agenda through the strategic framework of your organization and not just leaving it as a kind of nice to have add-on checkbox exercise. So that's what we're asking people to do. If you want to show your commitment, sign the pledge. You can find that on the CIH website, cih.org. And a final shout out as well for all members to fill out the EDI census so you can help us diagnose before taking action. So with that, it brings us to a close. Thanks very much for joining us today for this podcast on diversifying the workplace. A big thank you to our guests, Sharon, Dan, and Pedro. Thanks very much for joining me today.